I ended my last video on the subject of the military conscription with a somewhat superficial conclusion that it actually serves the purpose of, in a sense, taming the rebellious tendencies in young males. And I would like to start this video by somewhat contradicting the ending of the previous one. I always considered military conscription to be one of the means of achieving more cohesive society, and whether this is positive or negative is relative, as these categories do not objectively exist. There are variations of the compulsory duties a state can impose. For example, in some Western European countries, and yes, I mean you, Germany, don't talk about the war, you have the alternative to undertake labor duty instead of military service. I will return to the economy of this phenomenon later on, but for now I would like to concentrate on a finer, call it broad philosophical point, by butchering again the eternal work of the great minds of the Western thought. And this is going to be difficult to be summarized and simplified in few sentences. And not because I underestimate you, the viewer. I have problems simplifying complex topics. Alright, first of all, you may have gathered that when I spoke about the crushing of the youth, the PTSD caused by the military service and the scarred individuals the system produced, I meant myself and a large group of people with similar experiences. But there are at least two other large groups of individuals that I can think of. And firstly, there are those truly sanguine, strong individuals who pass through the same experiences unscathed, and to them the service remains a fun adventure from their youth. And secondly, I presume, and I have met people like these, there is yet another group which, if you allow me to knock off Hegel, share consciously or not the Hegelian view of the state, where citizens both know their place and choose their place. They both know their obligations and choose to fulfill them. Though I am absolutely sure that while the vast majority of them love the state with genuine patriotism, only few have transcended the simple team spirit by reflectively endorsing their citizenship. I personally well understand where Hegel comes from, because I have read out of curiosity the Institutes of Christian Religion, but I can assure you that hardly anybody has had access to John Calvin's works during the communism. Yet since I will finish this video talking about the great immortal George Orwell and his masterpiece 1984, I believe that the first modern instance of dystopian totalitarian state where Orwell's idea he termed doublethink can be discovered is probably the Calvinist Geneva from the 17th century. If one wants to summarize the main controversy of Calvinism, Jesus begs each person to accept him and would gladly allow them to do so, while sovereignly knowing that many, if not most, are in no way capable of doing so because he has not chosen them. Yet everyone should believe and accept this personal invitation. I guess this extends to all fundamentalist religions, which simultaneously claim that humans can't know the mind of God, while at the same time they have to pretend they know it by assuming that they have been commanded to undertake certain actions. Now that I am mature, reflecting on the events from the past, I find it ironic that communists adhere to, or rather relied upon, citizenry forced to slave labor, the justification for which can come from their ideological adversary. Where Marx pointed out that in capitalist society the worker's alienation from his humanity occurs because the worker can express labor only through a system of industrial production in which each worker is an instrument, a thing, if you wish, and not a person. Perhaps some statesmen were really benevolent Freudian adepts. And I will here quote the great last work of the old Dr. Sigmund Freud, written over 90 years ago. Laying stress upon importance of work has greater effect than any other technique of living, in the direction of binding the individual more closely to reality. In his work he is at least securely attached to a part of reality, the human community. Work is no less valuable for the opportunity it provides for considerable discharge of libidinal component impulses, narcissistic, aggressive, and even erotic, than because it is indispensable for subsistence and justifies existence in society. And yet, as a path to happiness, work is not valued very highly by men. They do not run after it as they do after other opportunities for gratification. The great majority work only when forced by necessity. And this natural human aversion to work gives rise to the most difficult social problems. And unquote. But no, in the end, there is no benevolent state with benevolent statesmen who simply intend to cure your depression by labor and service therapy. I skipped a sentence here, and it goes like this. The daily work of earning a livelihood affords particular satisfaction when it has been selected by free choice. So how can you constantly fight human natural aversion to labor? Simple, constant fear of authority is not enough. At one point, many individuals would become apathic. Others may start questioning the societal order, despite the years of brainwashing at school, during service, whatever. A surreal fear related to a certain creed, faith, religion, accomplishes the mission in psychologically acceptable way. It may come as a surprise to the Westerner who was raised to fear Russia, and I'm sure very few ever made clear distinction between Russia and the USSR. Obviously nowadays the boogeyman is back under its original name, but I grew up during the Reagan years in an atmosphere of a constant fear that the West would attack us, directly or via proxy, but quite often as a child I would look up to the sky and fear that an American flying fortress would drop the A or the H bomb on us. The Cold War really secured solid and stable peace. War was truly a peace. And here I reach the crux of this video, because you must have recognized the quote. War is peace. George Orwell is often mentioned but never quoted, and he deserves to be read aloud. And I will read the paragraphs from the War is Peace chapter, which I find prophetic. The splitting up of the world into three great superstates was an event which could be, and indeed was, foreseen before the middle of the 20th century. In one combination or another, these three superstates are permanently at war, and have been so for the past 25 years. War, however, is no longer the desperate, annihilating struggle that it was in the early decades of the 20th century. It is a warfare of limited aims between combatants who are unable to destroy one another, have no material cause for fighting, and are not divided by any genuine ideological difference. And I highlight this part. This is not to say that either the conduct of war or the prevailing attitudes towards it has become less bloodthirsty or more chivalrous. On the contrary, war hysteria is continuous and universal in all countries. But in a physical sense, war involves a very small number of people, mostly highly trained specialists, and causes comparatively few casualties. The fighting, when there is any, takes place on the vague frontiers whose whereabouts the average man can only guess at. In the center of civilization, war means no more than a continuous shortage of consumption goods and the occasional crash of a rocket bomb, or shooting, or explosion, or a car driving through crowd, which may cause a few scores of deaths. War has in fact changed its character. More exactly, the reasons for which war is waged have changed in their order of importance. To understand the nature of the present war, for in spite of the regrouping which occurs every few years, it is always the same war, one must realize in the first place that it is impossible for it to be decisive. Insofar as the war has a direct economic purpose, it is a war for labor power. All the disputed territories contain valuable minerals, but above all they contain a bottomless reserve of cheap labor. By their labor, the slave populations allow the tempo of continuous warfare to be speeded up. But if they did not exist, the structure of world society and the process by which it maintains itself would not be essentially different. The primary aim of modern warfare, in accordance with the principles of doublethink, this aim is simultaneously recognized and not recognized by the directing brains of the inner party. So, modern warfare is to use the products of the machine without raising the general standard of living. From the moment when the machine first made its appearance, it was clear to all thinking people that the need for human drudgery, and therefore to a great extent to human inequality, has disappeared. If the machine were used deliberately for the end of hunger, overwork, dirt, illiteracy and disease, these could be eliminated within a few generations. And in fact, without being used for any such purpose, but by a sort of automatic process, by producing wealth which it was sometimes impossible not to distribute, the machine did rise the living standards of the average human being very greatly. But it was also clear that an all-round increase in wealth threatened the destruction, indeed in some sense was the destruction of a hierarchical society. In a world in which everyone worked short hours, had enough to eat, lived in a house with a bathroom and a refrigerator, and possessed a car or even a plane, the most obvious and perhaps the most important form of inequality would already have disappeared. If it once became general, wealth would confer no distinction. It was possible, no doubt, to imagine a society in which wealth, in the sense of personal possessions and luxuries, should be evenly distributed, while power remained in the hands of a small privileged caste. But in practice, such society could no longer remain stable. For if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate and would learn to think for themselves. And when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that the privileged minority had no function, and they would sweep it away. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on a basis of poverty and ignorance. The problem was how to keep the wheels of industry turning without increasing the real wealth of the world. Goods must be produced, but they must not be distributed. And in practice, the only way of achieving this was by continuous warfare. The essential act of war is destruction, not necessarily of human lives, but of the products of human labor. It is a deliberate policy to keep even the favored groups somewhere near the brink of hardship, because a general state of scarcity increases the importance of small privileges and thus magnifies the distinction between one group and another. War, it will be seen, accomplishes the necessary destruction, but accomplishes it in a psychologically acceptable way. The war, if we judge it by the standards of previous wars, is merely an imposture. But though it is unreal, it is not meaningless. It eats up the surplus of consumable goods, and it helps to preserve the special mental atmosphere that a hierarchical society needs. War, it will be seen, is now a purely internal affair. In the past, the ruling groups of all countries, although they might recognize their common interest and therefore limit the destructiveness of war, did fight against one another, and the victor always plundered the vanquished. In our own day, they are not fighting against one another at all. The war is waged by each ruling group against its own subjects. And the object of war is not to make or prevent conquests of territory, but to keep the structure of society intact. The very word war, therefore, has become misleading. End unquote. War on drugs, war on poverty, war on diseases, the term is widely abused as means of propaganda for the psychological effect of it, for the association it invokes, for the fear, the necessity to sacrifice, to accept sacrifice, and so on.